I'm very worried about my son. More than worried at this point. Terrified. His behavior these past few weeks is not normal. Not healthy. It makes me think there's something wrong. At first, he would just come in and stand in the doorway. He did this at night, just before I'd be ready to fall asleep. I'd roll over to turn off the lamp, and he'd be standing there, in the doorway. I used to try to speak to him. I don't do that anymore. He never has answered me. He just stares. A couple of days ago, he graduated from standing in the doorway to coming in and sitting on the bed. He still doesn't speak. I've asked him what he wants. I've asked him if anything's bothering him. It's not like him to be so quiet. He usually waits until my wife is asleep. That's the part that gets me. She always falls asleep before me, and he has never come in when she's awake. But then, she didn't have a hand in this. If something doesn't change soon, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm starting to feel like he knows that I'm the one who killed him. Both my parents were surgeons, and I used to talk to furniture. I grew up in an area where the properties are so large and the families are so wealthy that they build mansions and walls enclosing themselves in to their own private paradises, never interacting with their neighbors unless by some strange coincidence. I was homeschooled until the age of 7, which is where the story ends. But first, it begins at age 4, when I can first remember what my childhood was like. As a young boy, I thought that staying isolated on your family's property was what all little boys did. Whenever one of my parents would go out, I'd ask to join, but they'd shake their heads explaining that only adults left home and only in very, very dire emergencies. Aside from this, I never wanted for toys or activities and developed what my parents described as a wild imagination. I began creating relationships with our household furniture, spending days conversing with them and naming each and every one. My parents seemed to indulge my imagination more and more, increasing the amount of furniture in the house dramatically. My father always considered himself somewhat of a handyman and often explained to me his love of constructing things and how he had handcrafted certain pieces. So 3 years ensued of deep emotional relationships I developed with the furniture in my home. Arnold was a soft sofa in the living room that seemed to move up and down as I'd recline on him reading my books. Sophia was my bed that shifted ever so slightly, rocking me back and forth as I slept. Sometimes I can even hear her humming softly. When I'd lay my head on the table in my room, Claudio, I could hear palpitations and rhythm to my heartbeat. I constantly spoke with Theodore, a rather small chair that was very responsive to me, making humming sounds and strange vibrations even when unprompted. But above all, I loved Gladys, the largest, softest couch in the home, the one who seemed to share my breath. All the furnitures felt so soft, so warm, and so alive to me. It's strange how fast things can change. It was a Monday, my 7th birthday, and my parents were in their workshop constructing a new piece of furniture as my present. A woman had gotten lost driving through the town, and although our gates were sealed shut, she managed to push her way through. She knocked on the door lightly, and I jumped up, having never heard someone approach the house before. When I opened the door, her expression changed to horror. She sniffed the air and gagged. Then she picked me up and began to run. Tomorrow I turn 27, and I've been rolling over in my mind if I should sit in the gallery while my parents are executed. The headlines had labeled them worse than Karl Brandt, having reconfigured 167 people by my 7th birthday. They were never branded as murderers because no one died, but it was much worse than that. 167 people to make 71 pieces of furniture. That's 664 limbs, reassembled in formations no mind should conjure. Sometimes people think I'm a Buddhist. There is no furniture in my apartment. Both my parents were surgeons, and I used to talk to furniture. I live in Osaka, Japan, and often use a subway to go to work in the morning. One day, when I was waiting for the train, I noticed a homeless man standing in a corner of the subway station, muttering to himself as people passed by. He was holding out a cup and seemed to be begging for spare change. A fat woman passed by the homeless man, and I distinctly heard him say pig. Wow, I thought to myself. This homeless man is insulting people, and he still expects them to give him money? Then, a tall businessman went by, and the homeless guy muttered, "Human." Human? I can't argue with that. Obviously he was human. The next day, I arrived early at the subway station and had some time to kill, so I decided to stand close to the homeless man and listen to his strange mutterings. A thin, haggard-looking man passed in front of him, and I heard the homeless guy mutter, "Cow." Cow, I thought. The man was much too skinny to be a cow. He looked more like a turkey or a chicken to me. A minute or so later, a fat man went by, and the homeless man said, "Potato." Potato? I was under the impression that he called fat people pig. That day, at work, I couldn't stop thinking about the homeless man and his puzzling behavior. I kept trying to find some logic or pattern in what he was muttering. Perhaps he has some kind of psychic ability, I thought. Maybe he knows what these people were in a previous life. In Japan, many people believe in reincarnation. I observed the homeless man many times and began to think my theory was right. I often heard him calling people things like rabbit or onion, or sheep or tomato. One day, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to ask him what was going on. As I walked up to him, he looked at me and said, "Bread." I tossed some money into his cup and asked him if he had some kind of psychic ability. The homeless man smiled and said, "Yes, indeed, I do have a psychic ability. It's an ability I obtained years ago, but it's not what you might expect. I can't tell the future or read minds or anything like that." "Then what is your ability?" I asked eagerly. "The ability is merely to know the last thing somebody ate," he said. I laughed because I realized he was right. He said bread. The last thing I had eaten for breakfast that day was toast. I walked away shaking my head. Of all the psychic abilities someone could have, that one must be the most useless.